Ibero, que no fue algo que habíamos planeado, pero tiene la ventaja de que hemos invitado a asistentes de la feria para que puedan ver un poco las actividades que hacemos en el Departamento de Ciencias Sociales y Políticas. Reunimos en este seminario 1 o 2 veces al mes y presentan los mismos profesores del departamento o invitados de dentro de Ibero o de fuera. Y es una oportunidad de hablar de los trabajos de investigación que están llevando a cabo diferentes personas. Y bueno, entonces hoy tenemos yo creo que esto ahorita solo tiene que poner entendido. Bueno, hoy nos va a presentar Patrick Inglis y luego nos va a comentar Marisol, Silva, Laya. Pues voy a leer una biografía brevemente de ellos dos para presentarlos. Patrick es profesor visitante en el EQUIDE, aquí en la Ibero, y es investigador asociado en el Centro de Estudios Espinosa Iglesias y profesor de Sociología en Grinnell College en Estados Unidos. Su docencia e investigación se enfoca en el trabajo, la inequidad y el desarrollo global. Su primer libro, Narrow Fairways, Getting By and Falling Behind in New India, publicado por Oxford University Press en 2019, se trata de las vidas de caddies pobres, castas inferiores que llevan las bolsas de golf de los socios en clubes exclusivos de Bangalore, India. El libro destaca cómo las élites aseguran y extienden los privilegios de clase y casta al mismo tiempo que ofrecen una crítica necesaria, al mismo tiempo que el libro ofrece una crítica necesaria a la actual estrategia de desarrollo de la India, que presta muy poca atención a la promoción de la atención médica, la educación y otros servicios sociales básicos. Yo creo que lo que vamos a escuchar es otra investigación, pero una continuación de esto. Y Marisol es pedagoga con doctorado en educación, la actual directora de investigación y posgrado aquí en la Ibero. También se desempeña como docente en los niveles de licenciatura, maestría y doctorado. Sus trabajos de investigación se enmarcan en las líneas de calidad y equidad en la educación superior y política pública en educación. Ha llevado a cabo numerosos proyectos de investigación sobre calidad y evaluación de la educación, equidad y justicia en educación, políticas de educación superior y el primer año universitario. En torno a estos temas ha publicado varios artículos, capítulos y libros. Fue presidenta del Observatorio Ciudadano de la Educación, pertenece al Sistema Nacional de Investigadores Nivel 2 y al Consejo Mexicano de Investigación Educativa. Participa en diversos comités editoriales y de dictaminación en revistas especializadas. Bueno, pues bienvenidos a ustedes dos. Y pues la dinámica va a ser que platicas 30, 40 minutos, o lo que tú quieres, luego escuchamos de Marisol y luego abrimos discusión.
It might surprise some of you, but my native language is English, so I'll speak in English, not Spanish. I don't want to take up too much of your time. Thank you to Marisol for offering comments, and I'll speak for maybe 20, 25 minutes, and then we'll get some comments from Marisol, and then we'll open it up and have a conversation. So this paper that I'm presenting today is part of a larger book project. And I'll talk a little bit about the history of the research in a moment. But the book project is called Paying It Forward, The Promise and Burden of a Good Education. So it's about educational philanthropy, particularly in India. And the focus is on this one school that's called Shanti Baba, that's outside of Bangalore, India, which is in the south of India.
Could you speak up?
Sure, I can speak up. Okay, is that better? Okay, all right. To give you some context, here's the front cover of my first book, narrow fairways, getting by and falling behind in the new India. This was another longitudinal project. The second book project is very similar in terms of its time frame. I started this book project in 2007 and finished the field work in 2017, 2018, and the book was published in 2019. I developed a few concepts that relate to the interactions between these 4 lower caste golf caddies who are just contract employees. They're often treated like employees, but they're not formalized. There's no union. They don't get regular pay. They don't get health care regularly. Everything depends on the wages and the tips that they get from individual members at the end of a 5 to 6 hour round of golf. So a few concepts that I sort of develop in the book. One is this notion of a government in miniature, that each of the wealthy upper caste members of these very wealthy, elite, exclusive institutions, there were 3 golf courses that I did the research at, that each of these members sort of acts as a government in miniature, right? Sort of, declaring that one caddy or another is deserving of the money that a member might give them at the end of the round, right? And so there's this long-term relationship that is developed between individual members and their golf caddies, right? So every member had their chosen 1 or 2 golf caddies that they called up or texted every week, and they arranged a round of golf with them, okay? So all these caddies depended on maybe between 10 to 15 different members of these golf clubs to provide them with not just tips, right, to get by day to day, but also to provide them with interest-free loans to pay off their own family debt, to help their children go to school, right? So there were the free government options, and then there are these low-fee private schools that may cost between 5 to 10, US dollars per month to send their kids to, and they get this money from the members of these private golf courses. So what I did is I didn't just study the members and their relationships or interactions, the economic exchange and the social exchange between the caddies and the members. I also tried to track the impact of that exchange on the lives of the family and particularly the children. And so I spent a lot of time with the children over these 10, 11 years of this research. And when I met with them, and some of the children were 3, 4, 5 years of age when I started this research, 10 years later, they're teenagers. And they had gone to either government schools or low-fee private schools. And walking them to school, sitting in the back of their classrooms, walking them back, and then sitting in on the sort of informal tutoring sessions that they received in the home over time. And these were all English, right? Supposedly English options for them. That 10 years forward, they weren't able to speak English. It was very sort of, I hate to say broken, but it was they had spent 10 years on the hope and the promise that they would gain fluency in English and have the capacity and the ability to go to university, and then beyond that get a good job. When I started the research, the caddies themselves and their partners, everybody in their family, assumed that the kids would become IT professionals or lawyers or doctors and accountants. 10 years later, some of the children were falling out and were dropping out. And some of them, if they were boys, they were becoming golf caddies like their father, okay? So what I noticed, and I saw this social reproduction, right? That generational poverty and inequality was being reproduced, right? And even though, many of the caddies didn't go to school, right? And they dropped out in the 3rd or 4th grade. So it was an improvement that their children were at least going to say 10th grade, even if they dropped out or failed at that point. But I could imagine, and we would all agree here, that it would take many, many generations for these children, for the children of caddies and their children and their children's children to come out of poverty, right? On the issue of caste, when I started the research, many of the caddies said caste illa. Caste illa is from Kannada, which is the local regional language in this part of India, and it means caste is not there. And every one of the caddies that I spoke to, as well as the members I spoke to, said caste doesn't matter. Caste is not a thing. It was only later in the research when many of the caddies were able to see that their children wouldn't really advance, right, in terms of education and their professional opportunities, that they came to understand that caste was a major factor, in many cases insurmountable. There was one caddy who, he and his family had taken on this government land, and he was trying to regularize it in the bureaucratic offices of Bangalore. And he found that just year after year, they were just turning him away and making excuses, until finally he realized it was caste. He was Dalit. He was untouchable. He was among the lowest castes of India. And for those reasons, he wasn't able to get the paperwork needed or necessary. Now, to fast forward to this research project, this is the school Shanti Bhavan. And I became acquainted with this school in the summer of 2014 when I was partway through my research on the first project. And I heard about the school, and I couldn't believe that there was this millionaire founder who made his money on Wall Street, who wanted to give all that money away in support of the social mobility of these poor lower caste children. So I became interested. And that summer in 2014, I spent many days, different trips at the school, which is in a rural part of Tamil Nadu, right next door to Bangalore. And I realized pretty quickly that what they were doing there was amazing. Okay, this is from the website. In 1997, Shanti Bhavan Residential School opened its doors in Baliganapalli, India, welcoming its first 48 preschoolers. In the 25 years since, hundreds of children have graduated from Shanti Bhavan, earned college degrees, and gone on to prominent careers in finance, technology, medicine, entrepreneurship, and more. Let me just sort of talk a little bit about the model of the school. It's a residential school, meaning it's a boarding school. And from the age of 3 or 4, these children go to this school and they stay on site, and they only see their families maybe once or twice a year for a total of 1 month, right? So for the whole year. And then they graduate 14 years later at the age of 17. Beyond that, they go to some of the best, most competitive colleges and universities in India. And increasingly, they're getting into universities in the United States. There are students at Stanford, at Middlebury, at Dartmouth, at Duke, at the University of Pennsylvania. It's very, very impressive. Okay, so I'll talk more about this model as I talk more about the project. But so beyond their college degrees, they get careers. They get placed at Goldman Sachs and Ernst & Young and Deutsche Bank and HSBC. Amazon, Target, right? So when I'm learning about this in 2014 as I'm starting this research, and my reference, my comparison are the children of the golf caddies, that I'm seeing the caddies and the families themselves are sort of spinning their wheels year after year after year and not really gaining traction on this course of social mobility. And yet what Shanti Bhavan is able to do, and this is the promise of the founder, he can change fortunes of the children and the family in one generation, okay, which you see here. A little bit about the founder. As I said, he made his money on Wall Street. He was in the Indian Army in the 1960s. He was honorably discharged, left the Indian Army, and in the early 1970s, he moves to New York City, and he gets PhDs and master's degrees and business degrees at New York University. At the end of the 1970s, early 1980s, he goes to work on Wall Street. And he and his brother and some friends, they developed this software that then is purchased by many of the Fortune 500 companies on Wall Street. And in the 1980s and the 1990s, he makes millions and millions and millions of dollars. But he always had the goal or the dream to come back to India and open a school like this that he could help transform the lives and social mobility trajectories of poor lower caste children in particular. And that's what he does in the mid-1990s. He purchases this land and he starts this school in 1997. The first class of students graduated 13 years later in 2010, okay? So it's not just the academic excellence that Dr. Abraham George promises. It's this social impact. And it's the social impact that I became interested in. Let me just read a little bit from a quote that's taken from a journalist interview with him a couple years ago. Shanti Bhavan's impact is not limited to our children and their families. The values they have embraced motivate our graduates to help others in their communities to solve their problems and address their needs. In time, we believe many of our students will create even broader change by getting involved in the government, developmental organizations, or by becoming leaders of large corporations. The multiplicative impact, and elsewhere he calls it the multiplicative effect, of their contributions will change the lives of many poor people. Now, the idea here is replicated in many educational philanthropies, foundations, and institutions the world over, but particularly in developing countries, poor countries in the global south, right? The notion is that a person like Dr. George doesn't have the money to support and pay for the education of all the poor children of India. It's impossible. But what he can do is he can select the best and brightest among the poorest children, among the lowest caste children, and then instill in them not only academic excellence, but this idea of a contribution or a social consciousness to help their families, communities, and the society. In particular, what he talks about elsewhere is that each one, and he tells these children almost every day in these morning assemblies, that every one of them is responsible for carrying 100 others, right, throughout the course of their lives. And the notion is that each of those 100 others are themselves going to touch the lives positively of 100 more. So if you start doing the math, right, you can say, and this is he theorizes this, right, over the next several years, we're going to end, not just alleviate poverty in India, but end poverty, right? This is a poverty eradication program as he understands it, okay? Now, I, as a researcher, became interested in that part of it, right? You can take a group of kids and isolate them away from poor families and provide them an excellent, high-quality education that would be the envy of even the wealthiest Indian families. Provide them that and put them on an individual course of social mobility. But what are they going to do for others? That became the fundamental question of my research. Okay. Methods and participants. I'll talk a little bit about this and move on to some of the findings, and we'll wrap this up. I started the research in 2014 with interviews with 24 graduates. I've since interviewed 79 graduates, and just to give you some context, since 2010, there's been 168 graduates. And there's a group of graduates called the working graduates for obvious reasons. They're working. They're out of high school, out of college, and they're now working. Of the 120 of the 168 working graduates, I have interviewed and worked with 79 of these graduates. Also, this past summer, I spent time with 25 of their families, right? Okay, so more than half of the working graduates I've interviewed, not just once, in many instances, multiple times, right? Over the years. And then recently I've gotten to know their families. This is ethnographic qualitative research. I've combined the interviews with fieldwork and participant observation on site with the students and with the administration. It's also been research that has crossed boundaries and countries. I've done research and interviewed and met with graduates in Bangalore, of course, in different parts of Tamil Nadu, as well as New Delhi, Pune in India. This past summer, I got a chance to meet some graduates in Kuala Lumpur, as well as in Dubai. Previously, I've met them and interviewed them in New York and London, and also in Vancouver. There's one student who graduated from a Master's of Business Administration at Simon Fraser University. I'm from Vancouver, so it made it easy to meet with her. And I did have a chance to meet with her family in Bangalore as well. Reflexivity, positionality, I think it's important to say something about this. Obviously, I'm white, I'm Western, I have a PhD. For these students, and I'll talk about this in a moment, their exposure to Western educated white volunteers, they're almost all the volunteers are exclusively white and educated and from the United States. Their familiarity over years meant that they had familiarity with me, right? So there wasn't, I can't lay any claim to being friends. I would leave that for them to decide. But I didn't notice or experience any sort of rupture or obstacle, at least from my perspective, in gaining rapport and access to them and their families. Okay. And I can expand on that later if you'd like. Here's the puzzle that I'm trying to work out in this paper. This is one paper of the larger book project, right? And I'm specifically interested in the ideological assumptions and political commitments of these graduates once they've left Shantibhavan. And I'll read this out here. Here's the puzzle. Graduates are fierce critics of poverty and inequality in one moment, and they're champions of free market capitalism and purveyors of bootstrap individualism the next. And I'll talk about why there's something confusing or inconsistent about these two ideas that they hold in their mind and they share with me through the course of my fieldwork and interviews with them. So if that's a puzzle, how do I understand it or explain it or theorize? Okay. And what I say here, and this is the argument of the paper, educational philanthropy can, it doesn't always, but it can generate a double vision in beneficiaries that weakens, but does not completely extinguish their radical thought and passion for meaningful social action. But absent program reform, there are a series of recommendations that I'm making to the school, beneficiaries retreat into themselves and their work, okay? And in many ways, there's a lot of stuff written on the new Indian middle and upper middle classes, right? And there's a sense that these new Indian middle and upper middle classes are primarily individual focused on their family, gaining more money, right? Salaries, higher salaries, better positions. And their reference is always the West, right? So they're not so much concerned about what's happening in India. And I noticed that in some cases, these graduates were becoming sort of like, mirrors or mimics in a way of these new Indian, new Indian middle and upper middle classes. Now, how and why do I develop this theory? Well, it comes from the school itself and its own pedagogical strategies. The graduates themselves have an idea of the village and what they refer to as the slum, right, where they come from, as separate and isolated from anything they've experienced within the school itself, right? And so they're encouraged to see poverty and inequality and caste specifically, and the obstacles that caste imposes as problems out there, right? It's not within the school of Shantibhavan. It's not within their private elite universities in Bangalore and elsewhere in the United States, and it's not within their places of work, okay? If there's any problems, and there are many problems in their villages and within their slums, it is blamed on government primarily. If business or private enterprise is implicated in the corruption and the problems that happen in their village and their slums, it's blamed on government, right? Government ultimately is responsible and is to be blamed for any problems that happen where their families and communities live. The second, and this is why I'm working on this theory, and I'm obviously interested in what you all think, and we get to the discussion. But there's this double vision. The first vision is of the village and slum out there, and then the boardroom, right? And how does Dr. George and the administration cultivate this sensibility within the school? The children, they learn according to a national English curriculum. This was important for Dr. George because when he started this school, he knew that they were poor, he knew that they were lower caste, and if he resorted to a reservation or some kind of affirmative action policy to get them into good universities or good jobs, people will stand back and say they don't really deserve to be here. So what he did was he raised the academic standards, right, and put them on track to do their leaving exams in a nationally or internationally recognized English curriculum. Okay, the instruction is entirely in English. By that, I think they have one or two classes in Hindi, and that's it. And Hindi isn't even the local language in the south of India. Okay, Western educated, predominantly white volunteers don't just volunteer and help cook a meal. They're actually teaching classes, right, on economics and social studies, history, English literature, etc. And so there's a small contingent of permanent Indian trained teachers at the school, but many of the classes are taught and organized by these Western volunteers who come predominantly from the U.S., although also parts of Europe. There's also workshops and guest speakers and tie-ups with multinational corporations. So Goldman Sachs, for instance, will send a group of their employees out on a weekend visit to work with the grade 11 and 12 students on their resumes, their curriculum, you know, their CVs, their resumes. They do a kind of like Shark Tank competitive thing where different groups of students have to come up with different ideas and projects and sort of sell them or market them in front of these employees from Goldman Sachs. And so this is happening weekly or monthly, right? So the exposure to business, private enterprise, and Western thought and ideas is very central to their understanding and helps to explain this sort of double vision, right? Now, the idea of a double vision in practice is that double vision can be disorienting and confusing, and that's what I lay out in this paper as well. What I draw out is a 3-step analysis that I've drawn or pulled from my interviews with them. And I'll lay this out and give you some examples of quotes, and then we'll wrap it up. In the first step, they're sharing with me this critique of poverty and inequality within the village, within the slum. In the second step of their analysis, they're suggesting that all public problems can be solved by private enterprise, okay? Now, in the third step, they're stepping back, and this is after years. And one of the benefits of a long-term ethnographic project is that the graduate I meet in 2014, then in 2016 and 17, by the time we get to 2022 and they're in their late 20s or early 30s, I can say, well, how is it working out, right? Are you actually able to sustain this commitment to family, community, and nation? And if so, what are the practical steps you're taking to apply what you've learned, right? Now, in that moment, and here's this third step of this analysis, there's a sort of sitting back and going, you know what? I realize now that all those things that Dr. George taught me aren't actually working out in practice. And they develop almost radical critique of philanthropy and private capital. Whereas in previous years, they're very favorable to private capital. More recently, they become skeptical that the private sector is the most efficient, sufficient way of addressing these large problems. Now, some of them take that information and that critique, and because they don't have any other framework or way of thinking about social problems, the only framework is the private sector. They're in retreat. So they're not engaged in the political process. They don't know poor lower caste people's movements. They're not tied to worker struggles, right? And as a result, they sort of step back and go, you know what? I don't think I'm a change agent or a change maker at all, right? Okay, so I'll give you a few examples of the quotes, and I have a couple things to say in the conclusion. So in this first step of this analysis, one student is saying, the rich keep getting richer, the poor just remain where they are. So I'm asking this student in this context, this is several years ago, right? How do you understand why your family is still poor generation after generation after generation? And here's the answer. But you'll notice with the quotes that are tied to the second step of this analysis, that this understanding falls away, okay? Here's another quote. I noticed that, and this is about caste, I noticed that in every situation, the person who's cleaning the house or the person who's doing the kitchen work, they all belong to the scheduled castes or scheduled tribes. Now, this is interesting because as you'll see in the second step, they imagine that caste simply doesn't matter within, say, a Goldman Sachs or an Amazon, right? Even though the many researchers have shown that upwards of 80 to 90% of people who are working in professional, in the formal sector of the economy are middle and upper class, and they're middle and upper caste people. But for them, they only see caste in their village and in the slum. For many of them, except a few, many of them, most of them have siblings, right? And one of the saddest things is that they're the only one in their family, even their extended family, who gets to go to Shantiwal. So what they notice over time is that when they keep coming back for the 1 or 2 visits a year, that their siblings or their younger cousins, even their older cousins, are not physically, growing to the same, to the same height and weight that they are. They're also not learning English because they're subjected to the kind of education that the golf caddies and their children are getting, right? And this was what was one graduate who said this: you study until the 12th grade, maybe the 10th, but there's no point. You don't get good jobs. Sometimes you don't get any job. So I understand in this first step analysis, this incisive critique and understanding of what's happening within their communities, right? To explain why people are poor generation after generation after generation. And here's some of the things that they say in the second step. Corruption and bribery doesn't happen as often. And even if it does, it's exposed, right? And so with corruption and bribery are things that happen outside of the private sector, not within the private sector. And again, if it happens, it's exposed, okay? Working with these good companies, I get a broader perspective. Many of these companies, they help NGOs, giving them books or helping them educate kids. There's a typo here. Every private multinational, whether it's domestic or multinational firm, has been obligated by the law for the last decade or so to set aside 2% of its profits to what are referred to as corporate social responsibility programs. Now, what makes up the sort of content of those corporate social responsibility programs? So I've mentioned Goldman Sachs, and you can let Goldman Sachs sort of stand in for many of these firms, right? Just for the sake of brevity. But say Goldman Sachs has a corporate social responsibility program. And once every 4, 5, or 6 months, the employees can select their Saturday afternoon activity, and it might be to go help find stray dogs. It might be help to read some orphans in a poor area of Bangalore. It might, these are the kinds of things that they're doing, but it's once every 4, 5, 6 months, right? It's not really engaging with solving problems. But here's one graduate suggesting that, this is sufficient. This is a good thing. These corporations care about people who are poor and suffering the effects of inequality. Here's one graduate who I think sort of, it's a perfect demonstration and something that came up in a lot of the interviews, right? The idea that the way free market capitalism operates is more or less the way all of society should operate. My job is to take care of my unit. Because I had asked him in this moment, well, like, what are you doing to help your family? And why does the family next door struggle with poverty? So what he's saying is, my job is to take care of my unit, my family. That's the capitalist story of investing in one unit and making that strong. You expect other people to do the same thing. I had to make it happen. So I asked all these students, why do you think you became so successful, right, and have these opportunities? And even though they do understand on some level that it wouldn't have happened without Shanti Bhavan, but when I put them when I put the question to them in the moment, they revert to a sort of, I did this, right? It's not a result of anybody else. I did this, right? I had to make it happen. I had to fulfill the prophecy. This is the prophecy of Dr. George. It didn't play out by itself. So here's the last phase of this analysis. And I've come up with this header of stuck on philanthropy, because I think they are trying to work out, when I met them and they were in university and just out of university and they were just coming out of Shanti Bhavan, it's very easy for them to imagine that everything they had learned, right, they can apply immediately and transform family, community, society, right? So years later, they're saying they're developing some kind of skepticism and doubt about that project. And here's one graduate. The people who really make a difference, like Martin Luther King Jr. or Ambedkar or Gandhi, are people who've lived it and seen it, but we have not. Our parents shield us from it, and Shanti Bhavan shields us from it, right? And that shielding, right? 14 years in this residential school where you only see your family once or twice a year, right? This is what this graduate is referring to. He is seeing this as problematic, okay? What Shanti Bhavan is offering isn't revolutionary. It's literally the bare minimum that kids from privileged class environments have access to on a daily basis. And when I asked this graduate to explain, why does Dr. George do what he's doing then? It's a savior complex thing, he says. Okay. Lastly, I've questioned if I am a change agent at all and how much of my life I should devote to living up to that ideal. I've taken a step back. Okay. So some implications, and this is the sort of stand-in as my conclusion. And so I'm working with these theories to try to understand, and I do ultimately want the work not just to be beneficial to us academics and intellectuals, right, but also to be of some use to the school itself, right? So what are a series of recommendations that I would make to the school, and I'm in the process of doing that. But one thing to notice right away, and so, you know, there's the political scientist, philosopher, Wendy Brown. She has a book called Undoing the Demos. And she compares and contrasts these impulses from Adam Smith, the truck, barter, and exchange, right? The sort of this very neoclassical understanding of free market capitalism and how and why it functions, right? And there's this notion, this homo economicus, right? That within each of us is that impulse, right? Now she's actually debating Michel Foucault, right? Who writes in the 1970s and 1980s, and the assumption that the rise of neoliberal capitalism has extinguished any sort of impulse to democratic citizenship and has highlighted and incentivized homo economicus. But what Brown argues here is there's actually homo politicus too, right? This civil sensibility that lies within each of us, right? And what I'm noticing with the graduates themselves is evidence of homo politicus, right? By the third step, right? This sense that, hey, like maybe just being an entrepreneur and getting like the next promotion or making more money and working in Goldman Sachs and getting, you know, and then, you know, trying to apply for a job in New York, maybe that's not all there is to helping my family and society. And there's something else, right? But they're not sure what that something else is. I see hope and aspiration in the third analysis. I'm not cynical, although I think some of the graduates themselves are. Theoretical paradigms. I've been rereading Paulo Freire in his book Pedagogy of the Oppressed lately, and he makes a distinction between those among the oppressed classes who see their contribution to the poor, they want to help the poor or do something on behalf of or for the poor, right? Versus with the poor, collaborating with the poor to solve the intimate details and problems of their everyday lives, right? Now, this is one of the, and I've had some arguments with Dr. George, the founder. I had a 3 to 4 hour conversation with him last summer, in fact, where we had an argument about to what extent should he try to bring in and not sever a connection with the families, but to reinforce that connection with the families and to have whatever the family's going through serve as some sort of pedagogical purpose within the school itself, right? He's not quite sold on that yet. But I think the implication or the problem or consequence of not being committed to the families and consistently committed to the families is that he's raising students who become graduates and then professional, you know, salary professionals who don't really know how to impact their communities and the society in a broader, more meaningful fashion. And then lastly, I think the students, I wouldn't say get rid of all the entrepreneurial pro-capitalist stuff, because let's be honest, if you're a poor person, whether in Mexico, India, or anywhere, right, there's a potential to get a better job, and with a better job, more money, and to help your family put food on the table, and that's the way that people come up. So I wouldn't say do away with the entrepreneurial, you know, pedagogy, but it needs to be balanced with alternative models. So the student who says, like, I don't see myself as a change agent, I'm sitting back, right? Rather than her making that determination, maybe she has other models to reflect on and work with, right? Rather than the only model that's been cultivated or instilled in her, right? There's Dalit, untouchable, lower caste movement, working people's movements, these kinds of things that the graduates right now, and even the children who are going to the school presently, have no notion, no understanding of this whatsoever. Okay, and I'll finish it there. I'll turn it over to you, Marisol. Thank you very much. I hope I was loud enough, not too loud.
Gracias. Pues muchas gracias, Patrick, por compartir este trabajo. Y bueno, creo que después que me lo mandaste, avanzaste en algunas cosas. Y bueno, de eso comentaré un poquito. Lo primero que quería pues compartirte y compartir a quienes están participando en el seminario es que me parece un tema relevante y un problema que amerita ser estudiado. El tema, evidentemente, de la desigualdad, de la equidad y, sobre todo, retomar esta aspiración de movilidad social que ha sido, digamos, por mucho tiempo una de las aspiraciones asociadas con la educación, pero que este caso que tú estudias pone en cuestionamiento qué tipo de movilidad social y cómo es que la educación tendría que tener esto como uno de sus objetivos. Entonces me pareció realmente muy interesante y muy relevante aportar esta mirada al estudio de este tema, bueno, que nos tiene ocupados y ocupadas a muchas en el tema de educación. También me pareció interesante el tema de educación filantrópica, que yo realmente no lo había topado en mis revisiones, en mis estudios, un poco en el tema, en el campo educativo, y me doy cuenta que es un tema relativamente emergente. Yo hice una búsqueda muy rápida en Scopus para encontrar papers sobre el tema, y una primera búsqueda así muy rápida me arrojó apenas 32 documentos en Scopus entre el periodo 2008 y 2022, lo cual se me hace muy poquito. Entonces, es un tema muy poco estudiado. Me parece muy interesante que aportes a lo que está pasando con este asunto de la educación filantrópica y, bueno, muy relacionado, como decías, con el tema de las políticas públicas que se necesitan en educación. Entonces, eso es una cosa que me gusta, me gustó, disfruté la lectura enterándome de un caso de lo que realmente conocía muy poco. Es decir, bueno, más que las generalidades de la India. Por otro lado, esta modalidad de intervención social, esta de modalidad de educación filantrópica, me parece que conecta con cierta literatura relativa a lo que ha predominado en el campo, relativa al estudio de la desigualdad y, digamos, en su visión más positiva, relativa a la inclusión de los sectores tradicionalmente excluidos, que es finalmente lo que interesa. Y entonces, haciendo algún contraste con esta literatura, viendo qué es lo que está aportando el caso que tú estudias y el análisis de la educación filantrópica, una de las dimensiones que han sido insuficientemente exploradas es el abandono del Estado y las políticas estatales como bien común a favor de la intervención privada. Sí se ha, particularmente en educación superior en México y en otras partes del mundo, pero quiero hablar de México y de muchas regiones y otros estados de América Latina, en algún momento, digamos en la época más intensa del neoliberalismo, el Estado abandona la conducción de la educación, me refiero particularmente a la educación superior, entonces prolifera la educación superior privada, pero una educación básicamente comercial que no tiene en el fondo una aspiración filantrópica, que tampoco quiero pensar en este momento que esa aspiración filantrópica sea beneficiosa. Simplemente digo que en América Latina lo que prevaleció y en otras regiones fue la privatización de la educación por el abandono del gobierno acerca de este, digamos, este derecho humano que es la educación. Entonces, este estudio aporta, digamos, esa mirada a un fenómeno más amplio que tiene que ver con justamente el abandono del Estado, bien sea vía la privatización exclusiva comercial neoliberal, digamos, como se dio en la mayoría de las regiones, o a favor de esta intervención privada con estas miras, digamos, filantrópicas, apostando a un cierto bienestar, pero que me parece que lo planteas muy bien. Habría que analizar qué es lo que está detrás de esas intenciones filantrópicas, que finalmente me parece que es una pregunta que queda ahí puesta, me parece interesante. En América Latina y en la, digamos, en la literatura prevaleciente sobre el tema de desigualdades, uno de los temas, y con la masificación de la educación, uno de los temas que emerge, o de los problemas que emerge, es la creación de nuevo de circuitos de menores calidades para las nuevas personas que se incorporan. Y esto pasó a nivel mundial. En ciertas regiones, como América Latina, se le ha llamado la inclusión excluyente, que, bueno, ya dice solo, incluye a esas personas, pero que finalmente quedan excluidos de niveles de calidad de educación que cumplen con ese motor de transformación y de bienestar. Pero me parece que lo que está poniéndose más, digamos, en evidencia con este caso particular, más que una inclusión excluyente que te metes a circuitos de bajas calidades y reproduces la desigualdad, en la teoría de la reproducción, es aquí lo que ocurre es un desclasamiento, que lo narras bastante bien en el artículo, y que finalmente conecta con el colonialismo, una visión occidental que se lleva a estas regiones, asumiendo como el modelo que permitirá resolver, digamos, el problema de pobreza, concretamente hablando de la India, y bueno, con esta visión de que lo occidental es el modelo a adoptar, ¿no? Y que tendría que ser el modelo de solución. Entonces, en ese sentido también, como por un lado se dan los temas de inclusión excluyente, aquí hay una inclusión que desclasa y resulta, digamos, en un efecto pues, de colonialismo, de expresión de colonialismo. Que creo que todas estas las miradas que aporto ayudan a entender el grave problema, digamos, como política social o como sí, materia social educativa a nivel mundial. ¿No? A mí me resultó pues muy interesante. Bueno, ok, de eso me refiero. Particularmente destacable son los hallazgos sobre las contradicciones de los graduados. Eso fue lo que me pareció realmente. Bueno, tú te propones como uno de los objetivos hacer una exploración en las narrativas de estos beneficiados de este proceso, de esta escuela. Claro, esas contradicciones que luego sintetizas en los 3 pasos, pero esta contradicción en no entender la complejidad de la pobreza, de no entender la problemática estructural, de tener una visión individualizada del problema y una creencia de que desde la acción individual se puede resolver, me parece que justamente es el reflejo de esa filosofía filantrópica colonialista. Entonces, creo que esos hallazgos tuyos y estas verbalizaciones, citas de los propios participantes son elocuentes. Cosas como culpabilizar a las propias familias, el bloqueo mental de sus padres y madres que impide el progreso individual, porque además en esos términos lo plantean como necesitamos progresar individualmente y esta visión que evidentemente disminuye la capacidad colectiva de una cierta transformación y que por ahí tendría que tal vez apuntar el tema de la educación. Y que esta formación recibida de élite restringe la capacidad de análisis. Eso sí es una cosa también. Este aislamiento en el que forma la escuela en una burbuja desconecta completamente. Hay cosas ahí que tengo que decir que hay cosas ahí que me preocupaban de experiencias más cercanas en esta formación de burbuja para luego intentar la transformación y no diré más. Pero creo que es un tema que nos interpela en alguna medida a todos y todas, pienso, pero claro, esto es un extremo. Pero bueno, sí, en esta cosa de apostar por la formación de las élites en una burbuja, digamos, disminuyendo su capacidad de agencia y disminuyendo inclusive es algo que es fundamental en la formación universitaria, la capacidad, el pensamiento crítico y la capacidad analítica y de comprensión, ¿no? Bueno, algo que también me pareció muy destacable es el trabajo de larga data que tienes, una etnografía llevada a cabo durante un largo periodo. Es una suerte de estudio longitudinal que da seguimiento a la trayectoria desde el bachillerato, la educación superior y algunos ya en el empleo. Me parece un trabajo fantástico para profundizar mucho en el caso, ¿no? Bueno, algunas cosas. Quisiera ahora hablar un poquito de lo que extrañé en este paper, que sé que es un primer borrador, y bueno, fue lo que leí y te lo comento, ¿no? A mí me hizo falta un marco de referencia contextual sobre el problema socioeducativo en la India y su ubicación en el escenario internacional. Me pareció súper importante, me hubiera gustado entender, bueno, justamente el funcionamiento de una sociedad en castas que, bueno, es distante a las desigualdades, digamos, que vivimos en nuestros países y que son el objeto de estudio, por lo menos mío y de otros colegas, ¿no? Sobre temas de desigualdad en educación. Entonces, la ausencia de ese marco de referencia, ahora entiendo que lo que planteas es que esto va a ser un capítulo de un libro más amplio, seguramente lo tendrás en otro, pero yo viéndolo como un artículo, digamos, autónomo, eso me hizo falta. Me parecía eso, que la organización social en castas ameritaba ser tratada, digamos, al menos brevemente, para favorecer la comprensión del fenómeno que se estaba reportando. También me hacían falta estadísticas educativas, justamente para entender. Entonces me metí un poquito a ver, digamos, las estadísticas de la UNESCO y del Banco Mundial, otras estadísticas. Y bueno, sí, lo que encontré es que es muy baja la matrícula, la tasa bruta de cobertura de matriculación de la India en educación superior, que ronda el 27%. Entendí. Claro, esto es reflejo de esa desigualdad y de esa distribución del ejercicio de derechos. También entiendo que hay un tema de que no es gratuita la educación y que todas las familias tienen que endeudarse para poder enviar a sus hijos, cosa que también le añade una barrera al ejercicio del derecho, y que también eso ayuda un poco a poner en perspectiva la acción de las organizaciones filantrópicas ante un escenario tan restringido que, por ejemplo, no se tienen en algunos países de esta región, hablando del sur global, que también lo metes como marco de referencia. Pero bueno, me parecía que las estadísticas educativas eran necesarias, términos de pobreza, esperanza de vida, sociodemográficas, pero particularmente educativas, acerca de las restricciones que hay y el por qué finalmente resulta tan importante. O sea, marca tanto la posibilidad de entrar. Una de las cosas que ponías también en el trabajo es que estos chavillos desde preescolar se separan de sus familias y bueno, para las familias puede ser un duelo, pero también es una descarga porque es una boca menos que alimentar, ¿no? Entonces, digamos, desde el punto de vista de alivio a la pobreza, que no necesariamente significa transformar, significa un gasto menos. Hay una serie de componentes ahí que me parece que, bueno, están allí en el tema y ayudan a entender el por qué tienen tanta aceptación, ¿no? Porque es un tema de sobrevivencia. Bueno. Ok. Se plantea un estudio exploratorio. Yo ya decía que es, bueno, según esta breve búsqueda, es un tema emergente, pero me faltó también marco de referencia sobre la propia educación filantrópica, sobre los debates que se están dando en torno a la educación filantrópica, sobre cuáles son los cuestionamientos que hay y en general cuál es el debate, ¿no? Desde el punto de vista de política social, política económica y lo que, cuál es la pieza que está jugando esta modelo de educación, modelo de intervención en un cierto en una cierta zona geográfica. En América Latina me parece que es mucho más débil su presencia, ¿no? Y que se aparece con más fuerza en esta otra región. Entonces, me preguntaba yo por qué, y algo de revisión de literatura o de marcos de referencia acerca de la educación filantrópica en general en el mundo de la educación. En cuanto a la argumentación, es clara tu posición crítica, y además yo también compartiría acerca de el riesgo de asumir acríticamente la intervención filantrópica como una intervención que va a ayudar a resolver el problema. Estoy totalmente de acuerdo. Lo que me generó un poco de desconcierto fue que aparece prácticamente desde el párrafo 1 ese argumento, y me parecía que necesitaba evidencias para ir llegando a esa conclusión. Al final, si forma parte de un un trabajo más amplio, me parece que ese argumento puede quedar desde el inicio. Pero claro, cuando lo empecé a leer, sentía, bueno, es ya una conclusión dada, como una novela que empieza por el final. Pero es un
Sí.
estilo que
Sí.
me parece que está bien, pero que claro, me parecía que cobraba más fuerza en la medida que se van dando evidencias encontradas en el trabajo. Bueno, sobre las conclusiones, lo que presentabas en esta primera parte, que ahora presentas con más amplitud, que me parecen muy buenos estos hilos de discusión y de tensiones que se presentan. Yo tenía algunos comentarios. Desde el abstract aparece como una conclusión que empieza, digamos, a colarse el asunto de poder, a través de este tipo de trabajos, hacer algunas recomendaciones a las organizaciones filantrópicas o no gubernamentales. Y de repente te lo pregunto, no sé, pensé que podía ser una posición un poco ingenua, pensar que si ya tienes un objetivo político, que es desclasar, colonizar y darle valor a lo económico, más que a otros valores sociales, comunales, como se pudieran dar aquí, etcétera, pudieran aceptar una recomendación de empodéralos, no los desclases, porque tendrían que ser por ese lado las recomendaciones. Y sin embargo, sé que estarías en un predicamento porque el doctor George se abrió contigo, te dio toda la información, digamos, acepta la colaboración, entonces responsablemente, claro que habría que dar estas recomendaciones. Pero al mismo tiempo pienso que puede ser ingenuo pensar que este tipo de recomendaciones van a incidir en una transformación, o a lo mejor sí, de este tipo de modelos, ¿no? De intervención social. Pero me parece que ahí hay...
Sí.
Nos pasa cuando hacemos investigaciones con organizaciones que nos dan entrada, entonces hay de alguna manera también un compromiso que no basta solamente con una crítica, digamos, lapidaria tal vez, ¿no? Hacia el proyecto. Pero bueno, ahí hay un tema de ideología. Mi pregunta, ¿es posible cambiar esa ideología? ¿Cómo habría que cambiar esa ideología? ¿Es real? ¿No? Y a lo mejor habría que también escarbar un poco más en cuáles son los fines últimos o abiertamente exponer la filosofía que los mueve, ¿no? Bueno, y creo que sí, vas en la lógica de, más bien, me parece importante criticar esa lógica de neutralidad, de eficiencia y de eficacia de esas organizaciones. Me parece que es parte de lo que recoges en ese anuncio de conclusiones. Y bueno, ya para cerrar también el comentario con algunas de lo que saqué de tu exposición ahora, insisto, me parece interesante repensar y retomar la promesa de movilidad social vía la educación. Por este tema de la movilidad social que te desclasa, que te aísla y que pues ha demostrado de alguna manera que la movilidad social es individual. En realidad, inclusive en nuestros estudios, una persona que va a la universidad, sin hablar de castas en nuestras sociedades, que de todas maneras son sociedades desiguales y estratificadas, una persona que va a la universidad y obtiene un buen empleo, se da una movilidad individual. Sí. Y me parece interesante incluir el tema comunitario, como lo estás haciendo, y de familia, ¿no? Porque desde otra perspectiva, desde otra posición política, no basta con que se salve solamente una persona, ¿no? Y en este caso, también me parece que vendría bien, digamos, un parámetro de contraste sobre qué hacen otros tipos de intervenciones, en los que sí ponen más en el centro la agencia individual, pero también social, el aspecto comunitario. Entonces, porque claro, decía, me parece que de alguna manera el planteamiento y la salida a este tipo de intervenciones es como un callejón sin salida. Ellos están planteando esta ideología y esta filosofía de trabajo, Y bueno, allí se agota. ¿Cuáles son las otras opciones? ¿Cuáles son otros modelos que están funcionando? Que los hay, que los hay. Y entonces decir, bueno, no es la única opción, tampoco es la opción esta inclusión excluyente que se da en el contexto de masificación de la educación superior a nivel mundial, que también se reproduce y se incrementa, pero reproduce desigualdades. Bueno, ¿cuáles son las salidas? Y hay algunos modelos interesantes que yo sí creo que habría que contrastarlo para no dejarlo como un callejón sin salida y como un problema sin solución. Bueno, algunas otras cosas en el campo de lo individual que me parece, o sea, que pones el acento ahí y hay que hacer un recorte. Estoy convencida de que, bueno, no se puede abarcar todo y que el recorte es importante. Y colocas aquí la visión y la experiencia, la emoción de los propios beneficiarios. Y además de este desplazamiento y además de este problema más social y político, el problema individual también se me hizo devastador en el sentido de adjudicar una responsabilidad de salvación a ellos mismos que los mete emocionalmente en un problema serio y en un problema también de desencanto, ¿no? Porque algunos, no todos, algunas van pasando como de creer que pueden ser unos superhéroes, que se van a volver supermillonarios para resolver el problema, en la India, el país ahora más poblado del mundo, evidentemente, o sea, es una cosa mágica, pero luego a pasar al descontento y el desconcierto de saber que realmente eso no es posible y ver y darse cuenta que sus familias van a seguir reproduciendo el círculo de la pobreza. Entonces también pensaba como que en esos términos personales, ¿qué es lo que tendría que buscar la educación? Claro, la educación en términos de bienestar también tendría que cuidar como en la salud emocional de las personas. Este señor, el doctor George, le está, bueno, depositando una responsabilidad que difícilmente pueden asumir, ¿no? Desde un punto de vista realista. Ese elemento como, digamos, parte de lo que me parecía del recorte que haces en lo individual, en las personas y sus familias. Y bueno, creo que el tema filantropía, que es suyo, ha sido bastante criticado, por lo menos en América Latina. Después se utilizaron otros términos como tercer sector o como organizaciones que contribuyen al desarrollo y que creo que sigue, dada la emergencia de esta literatura y posiblemente de estas acciones, creo que es preciso seguir, digamos, criticando el término, ¿no? Cuestionando este tipo de intervenciones, así que me parece que tu paper aporta mucho en ese sentido. Entonces, algunos comentarios.
Muchísimas gracias.
Espero
Okay.
podamos dialogar.
I should respond. Okay, and then we'll open it up. I mean, there's so much there. I'll just make a few comments. I like the way you phrase like what Dr. George is doing without it meaning to is actually weakening their capacity to make radical social change. That I like that. But I thought of that. I hadn't worded it that way. So thank you for that. I agree. It's interesting. Back in 2014, when I met with Dr. George and his son, Ajit, who is now the director of operations and sort of and does a lot of the fundraising. And Dr. George is in his late 70s, and so eventually Ajit will take over the school. They've just opened up a second campus as well, so they're expanding. But when I met with them in 2014, they were so convinced of the model that it would work, so convinced that they brought me in and said, well, you're doing this research on the caddies and we like that, but we'll show you what works. And they brought me on as a researcher to sort of prove the concept. So maybe that was them being, but about I think there's something maybe wishful about what I think my research can do. Although, Ajit, more than his father, is sort of open to these kinds of critiques and conversations. I'm also in a difficult position because with the first project, I didn't care what the private members of these golf courses thought of me. I wrote very critical things about them. I just laid them right out in the book. I feel like as a researcher, maybe, and you know, as anthropologists and sociologists here, like, what responsibility do we have to the institutions that we study, right? And there are institutions that we don't like. Somehow we get in, and it doesn't matter what we write because we can hold up our own integrity. But this is a tough one for me because I don't want to do anything that would weaken the institution and make it difficult for them to do their work, you know. And when I sort of sit back and go, who am I, this foreigner? And so what if Dr. George helps a couple hundred kids and he gets them jobs at Goldman Sachs, or they go to Stanford and then get a job in New York, and they're helping their families come up, and that's all they can do. Right? They're not going to transform their community and transform all of India. You know, who am I to come in and say there's a problem? Right? So I haven't solved that problem, by the way. I do think that what the graduates are telling me is that they have their own skepticism and doubt of the project. In fact, it's more, I see their skepticism as more important than my skepticism, right? Because they're in their mid to late 20s and going, it's not as easy as we thought, as we've been led to believe. Not everybody listens to us, right? Some of them have younger sisters or female cousins who are being pulled out of school at the age of 13 and 14 and married off to an uncle who's 20, 30 years older than them. And there's nothing they can do about that, right? For all their money and their prestige and status, they find that there's not much they can do. You know, graduates who have no siblings versus graduates that have 5 siblings. 5 siblings is much more difficult to support than if you have none. If those 5 siblings are, if they're 4 or 5, you know, women versus men, that's a different challenge for graduates than graduates that have none or just all male siblings, right? So I do, the other thing, and you ask about the debate within educational philanthropy. So there's a lot of the debate, if I can call it that, is really more conceptual, theoretical critiques. I can't find any example. Maybe they're out there and I just need to, you know, redouble my efforts. There aren't many or any studies that take seriously what the beneficiaries of these educational philanthropies will do with that education. There's a lot of like, researchers might go into a classroom for a few weeks and they'll write a paper. There's nothing longitudinal about the long-term impact of these kinds of ideas in this educational philanthropy. The majority of the research I find, as I said, is conceptual and theoretical. And there's this hard left, radical left critique, which assumes that this is just neocolonialism, imperialism, and it's all to serve the interests of private individuals, to feed their ego, right? And to, in some way, sort of embed certain free market principles and ideas within certain communities or regions or parts of the global South that would be open to more profit-seeking activities later, right? So there's this assumption of bad faith, right? That anybody who gets into educational philanthropy is not really interested in solving the problems of poverty and inequality. They're not, right? So that, I would say that wraps up probably the majority of the conceptual theoretical critiques of educational philanthropy, right? I'm trying to do something a little different and coming at it, and it might be naive, but I have this sense of bad faith versus good faith, right? And sitting down with Dr. George and Ajit and these kids and taking them at their word that they want to address this issue or problem, and then run it forward. Well, what's the impact and effect of it, right? So that's where I'm at. In some of the conversations, I think it's going to take some work on my part. Like, I don't, when we have the conversation in 2014, they say, we have this concept, we want you to test it. Their assumption is it's all going to work out, right? And then 10 years later, I'm like, well, there's some issues here, right? So I've got to convince them of the worth of my research, right? And as an ethnographer, you always want to keep access open, right? So I want the work to be useful, but I also have to maintain or sustain my own integrity as a researcher too. may or may not be difficult. We'll see. The context, you mentioned the context. I think even though this is a larger book project, I need to do more in the paper itself to say, if you don't go to Shantiban, if you are poor and low caste, if you're living in a city versus rural parts of India, what are your opportunities? What are your chances, right? And then to provide some stats and numbers to back that up and to cite that there's a lot on that. So I agree with you. I need to provide more of that context for India, but then regionally, how does India fit along other developing countries in terms of its educational models and what it's doing? It's obviously not true that only can have success if you're poor and lower caste if you go to a Shantiban. There are different models, and I need to bring that into the discussion of the context. And you know this, but the paper I feel is already too long. But I've got to be more strategic in sort of cutting it down and bringing things that I think that any reader will answer or ask about. And then lastly, I think my Spanish is not advanced, but like I think you're sort of pointing to like what are the individual mental psychological what is the weight and the burden of that on individual students who are raised to believe that only a superhero, as you put it, can actually change poverty and inequality. What is that like? What is that burden like? One of the students that I referenced or quoted in the last step, as I call it, right? Like she's like, I'm not a change agent at all. I'm stepping back. So some of them have that thought about it. Others are, I mean, I grew up middle class in Canada, so I have no idea what it's like to have this burden or responsibility put on me. And this is what these do. There are some mental issues, psychological issues, emotional challenges. I found that over time, the students from the school who are right in university, they're the most like sort of they're wearing these rose-colored glasses, and they're the most excited and romantic, if you will, about the prospects of their education. And then by the mid to late 20s, that sort of falls off. Some of them deal with it and saying, listen, I don't feel any more responsible for fixing poverty than any rich kid that I went to school with at university. It's not my problem. Some of them will say that, right? Which certainly is not what Dr. George wants to hear. But no, I mean, it's the reason why the subtitle of the book is that there's a burden of this promise. And so that's a big part of what I'm going to get into. I think for this third step of analysis, where they're stuck, I think they could be unstuck with other alternative frameworks and ways of thinking about how to address these problems that they're observing firsthand with their families, right? And understand, they go to the school for 14 years, then they go to university, and they stay in dorms and hostels that are paid for by Shantiban. So again, in university, they're only seeing their families once a month, once every couple of months. So it's like 17, 18 years later, at the age of 22, 23, that they're really like, and many of them go back and they live with their families full time, right? And they're seeing it up close. And then they're like, traversing these two worlds, right? From the village or the slum and they're getting a bus, a chauffeured bus to Goldman Sachs. And that's a totally different world. And years and years after that, they're really stuck and they're not sure of the model anymore. What I'll do in the book is like, what else can Shantiban offer but this model or way of thinking about this problem? So I'll stop there in response to your comments. I could go on, but I'm sure there's other questions. Yeah. So
Questions here or on Zoom?
Hola, ¿qué tal? Mi nombre es Lucian. Veo varias paralelas entre lo que pasa con esta escuela y el programa que tenemos aquí en la universidad, Si Quieres Puedes, de becas. Y en ese sentido, y hablando de lo que menciona la doctora Silva sobre la inclusión excluyente, en ese sentido, sí me gustaría saber un poco tus conclusiones, Patrick, y las recomendaciones que harías para la escuela.
For this school,
Yeah.
what are my recommendations?
Yeah, what would you recommend?
You're at the Ibero.
Oh, for this, for the Ibero?
No, that's cool.
I have some recommendations for Ibero.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that. I think. It's hard to like. I guess when I was a kid, maybe you all have experience. You go to art class, and there are these like wooden boards. Just follow. just follow along. Perfect. And there's the wooden boards, and we take nails, right, as kids. And then you have thread, right, different colored thread, and you're threading and connecting, and you're creating, I don't know, what is it called, like some kind of, you know, not just image, but you're using the thread and the nails and the wood, you know. And I found that with the school, I noticed this on several occasions this past summer when I was in villages and different poor, you know, informal settlements across Bangalore, that in some areas there were maybe 4 or 5 kids that were currently going to the school, and there were 3 or 4 you know, kids that have graduated, were going to university, and then there were 2 or 3 working graduates. So there's 8 to 10 kids who have some sort of relationship with the school, but they don't know each other. Like they know that they went to the school. And the reason why I'm sort of working with this analogy or the metaphor of this board and it's like they're each these like nails on the board, but they're not connected, right? And so I'm thinking of a way to like present. It's something that I might work out in a separate project, actually in Mexico City, not something I can do in Shanti, but to suggest to them that they have to deepen the connections and the networks within the places that they already have a footprint, right? So, for example, and this was like, it happens to ethnographers and qualitative research. I'm sure this happened to some people in this room. On the last night of my field work in Bangalore, I stopped by one of the golf caddies, who's a central character of the book, of the first book project, and I helped get one of his nephews into Shantibai. Okay, this was, and then, but he had a daughter who was training to be a teacher. She had never had the Shanti Bhavan experience, and you know, these low-fee private schools. And I thought in the moment, wouldn't it be great if she could do her teaching practicum at Shanti Bhavan? And so then you've got this caddy's nephew and you've got his daughter, both coming at the school in different ways, but they're now connected. And then you add another child from this area to the school. And then you fast forward, I don't know, 20, 25 years, right? How are these networks being deepened and have greater meaning rather than just the individual story of these kids that are sort of randomly like placed across South India? So that's one of the things that I'm thinking of suggesting or promoting to them. I think the second thing, and then we'll move on, but like ideologically, and this is going to be the toughest thing I think to convince the administration, is that assuming that the families and the parents and the grandparents of the kids, and you know, Dr. George has described them as a lost generation, that this attitude towards the poor and their families is actually counterproductive. There's a 4-part documentary about the school called Daughters of Destiny. It's on Netflix. And in the first, and it's about 5 girls who go to the school. So they focus on the girls and the boys, and that was the decision by the producer and director at the time. Anyway, in the first 2 to 3 minutes of the first episode, Dr. George is standing in front of a group of parents on the first day that they brought their kids to the school. The kids are 3 and 4 years age, and he tells them, "Listen, you know, you don't need to worry about anything. We got it at this point." And I think that something needs to shift in the way that Dr. George and the administration thinks about, and I get this from, you know, Paulo Freire, right? It's like, it's not on behalf of or for the poor, but with the poor. And I think that's an ideological shift that and then you can lay out any number of pedagogical strategies to work with. But I think, first of all, I think there's an ideological shift that has to happen with the administration about the relationship and the collaboration with families, and not to assume that all poor people are necessarily, they're all drunk, or they use drugs, or they're lazy, or whatever else. And this comes out in some of the conversations with the administration, but rather to think about it more sociologically, anthropologically, that there's structural forces at play here that determine people's actions on the ground, and to sort of build that understanding within the students themselves. And that, you know, and then 20 years later, they might be in a better place to think more strategically and radically about what to do with what the education they've been given. So I have those 2 things. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. There's somebody on the Zoom who has a question. Oh, I don't know. Maybe, is that you? Are you
No, I think that's just
okay.
But I have a question.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
The case is just so interesting of the school. I think it almost makes more sense to me that there's a Netflix show about it, because I was almost feeling like this sounds like something that would be a television series. The way that they take these kids at this young age and sort of, because they're not just giving them a good education, they're transforming them. I mean,
It's a total transformation.
yeah, I mean, it sounds like indigenous schools in
Canada,
Mexico, Australia, other places. And I mean, frankly, there's a part of it that makes Dr. George sort of sound like this, not exactly a villain, because you can see that he's trying to do good in a way, but sort of a bit of sort of a crazy doctor figure or something, and because his sort of math of the 100 by 100 and you know, it's
wild.
Yeah. It's the kind of thing that, you know, you don't have to talk to a bunch of social scientists to start questioning it. I think anyone watching Netflix could question it. So one thing I wanted to ask was about sort of critiques specifically of the school that have either come through the Netflix documentary or local critiques, because, you know, thinking of its similarity to things like indigenous schools and so on. I mean, I can understand why families would be motivated to let their kids go, but, you know, you'd think that of all that have gone there, that there might be some family that all of a sudden says, you know, this is terrible. You're taking my kid away, and they pull them out of school or something. Or so yeah.
There's a you know, on the website they say that they've had hundreds of graduates. They've had 160. There's a high attrition rate. They bring in 24 to 26 children, split evenly between boys and girls for every pre-kindergarten class. And they've been doing this since 1997, right? So if you add up all the years of graduates, you would be in the 500 or 600 range, and they're in 160. So you take 24 to 26 students, and sometimes you fast forward 13 years, if you include, you know, pre-kindergarten, and you graduate classes of 9 or 12 or 15, right? More recently, they've gotten the attrition level down, but, you know, you're right. Some families do, after a period of time, they say, we don't want to live without our kid, or that child potentially is an income earner, right? And so that becomes a problem, right? The kids and the families of the kids that stick with it. Some of the older graduates do have some critique and issues and problems, but it's rare to have a graduate say that they wish it, you know, they wish they would do it. If they could do it all over again, they wouldn't have done it, right? There was one graduate this past summer who did say that, and was actually was angry because he has no relationship with his family. And he has no relationship with his brother in particular, right? His brother came to visit him and had to stay with another friend because they just didn't get along and they didn't know each other, right? And this graduate was in tears explaining this to me, that, you know, and he said, you know, who is Dr. George to think that he can come into a poor neighborhood and take me out of my family for all these years? And so there's a resentment and anger. But I would say even in that case, it's rare. There wasn't another graduate that I met that felt that. A lot of them say that their father figure is Dr. George, not their actual. Their home, their family is Shanti Baba, not their actual. They say that, you know. So it's one of the critiques that it will be at the forefront of the book and what I write. yeah, I don't, you know, it's a tough conversation. These are tough conversations I have with the administration, Dr. George. But how they sell it, how the school sells it is, as you can imagine, right? This is a poverty alleviation program. We've got kids from lower caste communities who would have never had these opportunities, and now look at them, they're going to Stanford. And then they're working in New York at Goldman Sachs. I mean, this is a wonderful, and you can sell that, right? Yeah, but there, as I said, there's the critique and the skepticism and the doubt of the graduates themselves that I put ahead of my own. Other, yeah.
No, no es pregunta, tengo mil ideas, ¿no?
Yeah.
Porque como igual. Pero bueno, quizá tus propuestas para el Dr. Brown.
George.
George.
Dr. George, yeah.
Dr. George. Sí, o sea, estén en base a todo lo que has escuchado de las personas que ya fueron, ¿no? Entonces, en base a ellas, transmitir lo que ellas te están diciendo para que no sea tanto tu opinión, tu cosa, sino todo lo que has experimentado con estas opiniones.
Could you say that in English? I got distracted for a second.
Bueno, what I'm trying to say is that all the discussion with Dr.
Yeah,
George,
Dr. George and his son, Ajay. Yeah.
it's like you being the intermediate
Yeah.
of all the
Oh,
things
yeah.
they think.
Yeah.
No, not your opinion or what,
Yeah.
like a research,
Yeah.
but like what all the things you have heard from these people, no? Or this last, the third part of your research.
Yeah.
Maybe, no, I know.
No, it's, you know, sometimes what they say in response to my criticisms or the criticisms that I draw out of the research is to say, well, you know, of course, any upper middle class person is going to have a problem with even the idea of giving their child up at the age of 3 or 4, right? But actual poor lower caste families doing that. So that's one of their defenses, right? The other is that, you know, some journalists and critics have come in and they've sort of planted ideas in the minds of these kids. And so to the extent that the children or the graduates are critical at all, it's because the idea has been planted in them, you know. So, you know, but, and I just respond, you know, I mean, I've had multiple interactions. You know, if it was the case that they were just saying what they thought I wanted to hear, I don't think I would have sustained the rapport, deepened the rapport that I have with some of the graduates, you know. And some of them will say, like, you know, nobody from the school has come to visit me. Nobody has met with my family. You're the only one, right? Or that they'll say, like, I don't have a space within the organization to vent or to say what my problems or recommendations are. And so I've sort of been that go-between. That adds to my own sense of responsibility with the project too, right? Like, and some of them have thanked me for it, but you know, and yeah, there's a lot to say about that. But I think what I'm gathering is true. I don't think I've got all the wording right and the number count right for the article and all that, but that'll come. But the idea, the argument, and the underlying sense of things, I think holds up given the data that I have. Yeah. So, yeah.
Sí, solo era una cosa conceptual a propósito de la educación filantrópica.
Yeah.
Y Álvaro Murcillo tiene un trabajo sobre la dominación filantrópica.
Yeah.
Y cómo la Fundación Rockefeller influyó en la formación de internacionalistas en México.
Yeah.
Y eso no estoy seguro que sea un proceso de desclasamiento, pero lo que él problematiza es cómo se formó una élite intelectual o estos esfuerzos formaron una intelectualidad mexicana específica y eso generó una forma de ver el mundo, una forma muy específica, porque además los recursos iban a escuelas de élite, como el Colegio de México. Entonces, eso me parece muy interesante de tratar de relacionarlo como la parte de la educación filantrópica. No era solamente doy dinero para generar un proceso de dominación, sino porque realmente se quería ayudar a informar esos cuadros, pero sí generó esa distancia entre esa nueva élite intelectual que se necesitaba después de la Revolución Mexicana. Entonces, no sé si, bueno, por ahí creo que podría un poco problematizarse esta idea de la educación filantrópica o pensarla en términos también de una dominación filantrópica.
I mean, this whole 30, 40-year period of neoliberalism, right? I mean, I think I give one sentence to this in the article that I need to expand, right? Like by the 1990s, late 1990s, the sense within the World Bank and UN was that the only way you could really impact poverty and raise the education level of for working class kids was to bring in private money and encourage private foundations and institutions to do the work of educating for kids, right? Like, and that, you know, and even Dr. George, right? Like he opens the school in 1997, right? This is the Bill Clinton era, right? This is a decade or so after Thatcher and Reagan, right? And, you know, you have, you know, Fukuyama's the end of history idea, right? It was like, it was like the only game in town, right? The assumption was that you just privatize everything, hand it over to the market, and you'll have better results and it'll all trickle down, right? In terms of this time frame, like you run it forward 25 to 30 years, and here we are, and you're like, well, who is it really benefiting, right? Like what Shanti Bhavan, I mean, this is one critique. I don't know if it's entirely my critique, but you could say, you make the case that all they're doing is cultivating kids or producing kids who can then go be the sort of new class, the new elite of oppressors, right? Who contribute to profit and accumulation and the segregation and division within, and that's all that's happening here, you know. And I have a lot to say, but I wonder if there's something else though. You had asked about the state, right? Like, if the chance or opportunity of having a high quality education within government public schools is not so great, where are poor families going to turn, right? And when Shanti Bhavan opened, I mean, they had to like beg and plead families to give their kids up. But now every year there's lineups. Hundreds of families want their kids to go there, right? Because it's not just the state that has abandoned public education or high quality education. It's the poor themselves who feel that, you know, even like these golf caddies 10 years later, they understand their kids aren't speaking English. They're not graduating. They're not doing well on even the sort of most basic exams in the state, right? Yeah, I mean, if I get really cynical or pessimistic about it, I mean, I think it's the challenge of the 21st century is this problem of inequality and what to do with it. I mean, we do need a better distribution, a more equitable distribution of money and wealth, period, right? Now, Ashanti Bhavan and many other educational philanthropies are not questioning that problem, and that's an issue. What I'm trying to draw out in this paper somewhat is that the graduates themselves are having skepticism and doubt about this, right? Because they see it's not quite working, right? And maybe there's something to be positive. I think there's some hope and possibility in that, right? Yeah.
Vamos a agregar una cosa y es que, bueno, educación superior forma y luego no consiguen trabajo. No es particular del contexto en la India por el tema de pobreza, distribución y castas. Es un problema mundial.
Sí.
La falta de trabajo, digamos, especializado para personas altamente capacitadas. Y bueno, lo que se anuncia también son reducciones en el mercado de trabajo por temas de automatización. Entonces, claro, lo que está en juego aquí es el modelo de desarrollo. Las preguntas sobre cómo contribuir al bienestar basados en educación y conocimiento, pero dónde aplicarlas, cómo ir generando modos de vida distintos. Y creo que en el fondo está eso. Inclusive en México tenemos problemas de subempleo, personas altamente capacitadas que no consiguen y bueno, trabajan como taxistas, etc. Aunque es verdad que tener un título de educación superior mejora las posibilidades de conseguir un buen empleo, pero no es una garantía. Entonces, claro, una economía que no se está moviendo en el sentido de generar empleos, no le toca a la educación resolverlo, es un problema de política pública, ¿no?
Yeah.
repleto de modelo de apuesta que vamos a hacer todos con el planeta que se está destruyendo aparte. Entonces, entran como en juego muchas más cosas. Y claro, apostarle también a formas a un ingeniero electrónico o a un abogado en estas apuestas para que tengan esta profesión. Luego vayan a una multinacional a trabajar y a ganar mucho dinero. La verdad es que eso va a ser para muy pocos. Es una oportunidad para muy pocos y la gran mayoría se queda sin nada, ¿no? Entonces, digo, no es el problema de esta escuela o de un modelo, es el problema de estos modelos de desarrollo que necesitamos pues, cambiar, repensar.
Aquí solo para agregar yo creo que a nivel individual, personal, una persona puede cargar con ella misma valores, principios, ¿no? Llega a una empresa y quizá esos valores se pueden transmitir a nivel de responsabilidad corporativa, ¿no? Y entonces de ahí hay una difusión quizá a una escala un poco más grande en sociedad. Creo que eso también es un mecanismo que depende más del individuo y de la educación en familia y de algunos conceptos que tienen que ver no tanto con el gobierno, con política pública. Yo siento que allá también es quizá una manera de reconstruir, si queremos verlo así, la sociedad y cómo estamos viviendo la inversión en los demás y el impacto que deseamos tener.
Something that has come out with my conversations with Ajit, and he's the chief fundraiser and organizer and the future, president of the foundation. I was at one of the graduations a few years ago, and I won't mention which company, but there was somebody who was invited to speak to the graduates, and I was in the audience, and I looked up the valuation of the company, and it was hundreds of billions of dollars. And when I speak to Ajit, sometimes he's like, and that person who spoke, that company had yet to commit any money to the school. They're opening another school, another campus, and they're sort of auctioning off like the sort of naming rights to different classrooms. You see this here at Ibero, right? But I'm still struck at the valuation of some of these companies. What they're offering is to put their name on one classroom, right? To get their name on it. And they're not giving, it just maybe a few $1,000s, right? So what's the point here? Like, there's a level at which Dr. George and Ajit also have this critique of philanthropy and of the corporate model of fundraising, right? Because they're not getting the money from the state, right? But they've also got to like prop up these corporations and suggest to the world on their website that they're doing wonderful things for the school, when in reality they're just giving peanuts, right? So there's a way that the whole incentive structure of corporate philanthropy and educational philanthropy is really messed up, and even the people within it see it as highly problematic, right? They just don't know what to do because they don't have any alternative, right? Maybe we're all kind of stuck. Like,
What if we were to lower the standards of this project and say it wasn't about solving poverty? Let's say it was just about giving the opportunity for upward mobility to a few people, because that in itself isn't even that easy, and maybe with casts in India, maybe even more complicated. How would you evaluate it in that sense? Does that even work?
I thought of that idea. That idea is not sufficient to generate money.
I understand.
Like, if you say, listen, if you just make it very modest,
right?
Dr. George says, no, I don't want these kids to transform India. I want to get them a good education. They can help their families, have a little bit more money, right? And then, and that's it. They have no other responsibility but to help them. And on that measure, are they doing okay? Is that the question?
Yes, because you could sort of say maybe even, maybe Dr. George is smarter than I'm imagining, and he doesn't believe in the transformation thing, but he sees it as a way to get money. But he says, okay, I want to give, maybe especially in a place like India where upward mobility may be particularly difficult because of caste. Sort of an experiment to say, well, if we take these kids from a young age, will it work? You know,
Yeah.
do they enter into a different socioeconomic level? I mean, maybe one of the sort of ways to ask about that would be who they marry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And who do they count as friends? Where do they live? You know, so if they're marked by caste, you know, what he's done, I described this in the paper, but like his original idea was he didn't want anybody to confuse them with being poor or lower caste. So by the time they go to university, their peers are asking them, like, what schools, and they mention a boarding school, and their peers at university think they went to a boarding school in the US or Europe, and they don't correct them, right? Some of them are marrying outside of their caste or outside of their race and religion. I mean, that is happening. One thing I was thinking as you were talking is like, am I taking Dr. George too literally? Like, you know, we talks about hundreds of thousands of people and millions of people and eradicating poverty, and he's fine to say that. Maybe he has to do that to make money. Like, am I just taking this too seriously? But every time I speak with him, he's like, no, this is really what I mean, right? This is. I also sometimes wonder, like I mentioned something like this several minutes ago, but why should these kids who come from poor backgrounds be obligated to fix poverty and rich or middle class kid? Why? Like, and is it enough that they've become well educated, they're marrying outside of their caste or living outside of India, you know, and is that good enough? Is that sufficient? He would say no, but I mean, as a researcher, you know. Yeah.
And then the other part of my question there was, does it even really work? I mean, you know,
Yeah.
Or is there a certain kind of rejection of these people at some point when it's sort of found out that they're not who they appear to be?
Something I am thinking about, and there's a whole literature on this and a phenomenon of Dalit capitalism. So Dalit is like the politically correct term for untouchable and people who are oppressed within the traditional caste system. So there's this phenomenon of Dalit capitalism, and some of what the literature says is that people can get a good education, go to the right universities, even get a good job, but access to capital that they can then borrow to build a business or, you know, to even buy land, that's where caste comes back into play. And so these graduates in their late 20s, early 30s, like they're not at the point where maybe in their 40s, I mean, at some point my research has got to stop and I've got to write the book, right? But maybe in their 40s and 50s, being of a Dalit lower caste, they find that they can't get the access to capital that they need at the banks or the local lenders, or so I don't know the answer to that question, but it is possible. To this point, everybody assumes that they're middle, upper class and upper caste without bothering to question. Yeah, because ordinary middle, upper class people in India, they deny caste. And so what these graduates have learned, they've imbibed this way of this entire language and embodiment of anti-casteness that anybody within elite caste specific spaces would never assume that they're from a lower caste, right? Even their, like, they speak an accented English like mine, right? It's not a heavily accented Indian, like, and that's what upper middle class Indians are speaking. So nobody thinks twice about their caste, and they say it doesn't matter, right? So, yeah. Anyway, do you have a question? No. Other questions? No.
Una pregunta no muy profunda, pero ¿tienden a regresar a vivir, o no sé si ya lo dijiste, vivir a India o se crea como una diáspora?
Otra vez.
Sí. Do they return to India? Or I don't know if you mentioned
Yes.
that.
Yeah.
Or
Okay.
is it that can we say that a diaspora builds?
Yeah. They're uncomfortable moving back home. Many of them. Many of them, their reference is the West. And so if they leave India, they don't quite have an idea of coming back to India. Now, I asked Dr. George this point because, you know, when we first talked in 2014, he's like, he wants them to help transform and uplift others and change India. He sort of somewhat modified that. Like, if they make change in whatever part of North America they're living in, that's okay with him, you know? So they definitely don't want to go back to the slum or the village. They want to live in cities and they want to travel. And because of the somewhat fraught relationships they have with their families, that's okay. They send money to their families. They help build their families new homes or move them out of the slum or the village. But in some, you know, some of the graduates have told me that their families treat them like they treat them like an ATM, right? Like that's how divorced they are, like at an emotional level. So going to live abroad or outside of India, but sending money home for some of them is okay. Yeah.
Hay una pregunta en línea.
Stephanie, ¿quieres decirla? Stephanie.
Es el mouse.
Ya.
That's the mouse.
Es el
Pero
mouse.
ella te mandó algo
Me mandó una
en el chat.
Okay. There's a question in the chat.
Ok, dice que no, que está en la calle, que mejor la leemos. Ahí va. Muchas gracias por esta charla. Me gustaría realizar una pregunta. Entiendo la importancia central de la educación e inserción laboral como promesa. Esto hilado a la idea de un ser productivo y la posibilidad de contrarrestar la pobreza. Todo eso a nivel discursivo. Pero, ¿cómo ha impactado en el conocimiento y valores comunitarios a largo plazo?
Puedes decir otra vez la última frase.
¿Cómo ha impactado en el conocimiento y valores comunitarios a largo plazo?
The impact in the longer term impact of values in the community, but I'm not sure what she means by community. Whether she's
Well,
talking about the school community
so I think, yes, the graduates do help their siblings and cousins.
It's about education and
Yeah,
labor and insertion. The promise of a future.
yeah. So for them individually, it's been completely transformational, right? So how they think about caste, how they think about gender, these things are really progressive and liberal in their minds. They also take those values home, their communities, and they try to educate their parents about, you know, why you wouldn't marry off a younger daughter, why education for women is important, right? Why their own independence, if they're women, is important, right? So those values are being transferred within their communities and within their families, right? I think where the impact will be really felt is over successive generations when they start having their own kids, right? A lot of them, they get really stuck with their parents and grandparents about changing their minds about things, you know. If their siblings resent that they got the education that they didn't, it's more difficult for them to adopt certain similar values. So I would say that's a whole other, that was one of the papers I was going to give today, but I didn't finish that paper. I gave this one. Yeah, I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe is that it? I think. Okay.
Muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias.
Patrick, Marisol.
Thank you.
Creo que hay un vino aquí fuera, si quieres.
Sí.
Oh.